Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Conversation Series, Civil Discourse, Learning to Discuss, Not to Dismiss. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the Parent, Caregiver, and Community Engagement Office's YouTube channel. Please use the Q&A for questions. Live transcriptions have been also enabled. Now, land acknowledgement of traditional lands. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit peoples. Reconnaissance des terres traditionnelles. Nous reconnaissons que nous sommes accueillis sur les terres des Mississaugas, des Anishinaabe, de la Confédération Haudenosaunee et du Wendat. Nous voulons également reconnaître la pérennité de la présence des Premières Nations, des Métis et des Inuits. Now, as for our meeting conduct this evening, attendees are required to adhere to the TDSB's online code of conduct. Your participation signifies your agreement to abide by the full TDSB online code of conduct. As for online protocols, this evening, this chat is closed. Please note that the chat featuring is disabled for this session. And for Q&A, all questions can be put into the Q&A tool located on your Zoom toolbar. As for recording, thank you. Thank you. Conversation agreements, set an intention of how you want to show up. What is one thing you can do to support the conversation and learning? Differentiate between opinion and personal anecdotes and informed knowledge from data. Experience discomfort. It's necessary for growth. Expect to be challenged this evening. Recognize that your positionality informs your perspective and reactions. Expect and accept non-closures. Now, what is a conversation series? Well, it's a forum that brings together insightful speakers and informed community members into an environment where complex issues are explored, minds are moved, and our collective knowledge grows. It is built on the belief that meaningful conversation is a catalyst for change. Dialogue is an art practiced from diverse boundaries. And we also host 2 to 3 sessions each year, usually the third Thursday of the month, designed specifically for TDSB parents, caregivers, and open to staff and community. For this evening, we are so lucky to have an amazing speaker, Mr. Randy Boyagoda. Mr. Boyagoda is a novelist and a professor of English at the University of Toronto, where he also serves as the university's advisor on civil discourse, and of course, it's the first such position in the entire country. He was named one of Toronto's 50 most influential people by Toronto Life magazine because of his work in civil discourse. He is the author of 7 books, including 4 novels that have been nominated for the Giller Prize, the Impact Dublin Literary Prize, and named New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice Selections, and Global and Mail Best Books of the Year. Mr. Boyagoda is a husband, a father of 4, and lives in the East End of Toronto. He podcasts for the Toronto Public Library. Sir, welcome.
Thank you very much, Omar. Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by offering my gratitude to Michelle Munro for inviting me to join all of you this evening in this conversation about why thinking out loud together, why being open to discussion and difference rather than dismissing these things is a very good thing. It is a very good thing in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in our shared public lives, and when it comes to how we can support our young people and our children in their studies and in their own personal journeys from K through 12 and beyond. I think one of the reasons why I am especially grateful for this chance to speak with all of you is because, as we know from Omar's generous introduction just now, I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. I'm coming to you live from the U of T right now. And so much of the difficulty involved with dialogue across difference that I encounter in my work at the U of T and elsewhere leads me to the observation that we can't begin teaching students about the goods of civil discourse when they arrive at university. We need to begin much earlier than that, so that when they arrive at university, when they encounter different perspectives based on ideas or lived experience that doesn't reflect their own, they can respond to that in positive ways instead of negative ways. What I'm going to do this evening with you is three things. The first, I'll say a little bit about myself and why I have this job at the University of Toronto. Second, I'm going to share with you some of my observations about the areas where we see the most difficulties, the most challenges with people speaking to each other when they might disagree about something. Third, I'm going to propose some practical solutions that you could consider in your own lives, whether with your children or encouraging your children to pursue in their classrooms with their classmates and their teachers. Along the way, there will be opportunity for your own comments. Now, I'm very mindful there are many people involved in this session. And so the most practical thing, I think, would be that when I invite, let's say, a question, we're going to have to limit it realistically to about 3 questions only. And then you can use the chat function, sorry, the Q&A function in Zoom, which is available at the bottom of your screens, to pose a question. I'm going to do my best to answer these questions, but realistically, I'll probably only look at probably 3 of them before I move on to the next subject in this overall conversation and presentation. So let me begin with a sense of who I am and why I am here with you today. So as Omar suggested, my name is Randy Boyagoda. I am a professor of English at the University of Toronto, where I'm also the university's advisor on civil discourse. I can tell you a little bit, maybe in a little while, about my work as a professor and as a writer, and how that work has helped me become the university's civil discourse advisor. But in fact, I think my coming into this role has a much older story to it. My parents immigrated to Canada from Sri Lanka in the 1960s, and I grew up in Oshawa. Being the oldest child of immigrant parents, I was often the translator when someone called on the phone, when someone was at the door, when the Canadians were calling, whether again on the phone or knocking on the door. I was always the one from the earliest of ages sent by my parents to translate, to talk to the person who's there, understand what they were hoping to learn about or find out about, and then share that with my parents. And so I was in a translating mode from the earliest age, from people who have very different lived experiences and different perspectives, but live in the same shared community. And I mean, I was 7, I was 8 years old, and I can remember doing this on the phone and in person. And so what that means is from the youngest age, I have been someone trying to keep conversations going across differences. Now, I know we immediately think about civil discourse when it comes to politics, technology, inequality. We'll talk about that a little later. But mindful of the great and wonderful diversity of the city of Toronto, of the TDSB, I am sure that many of you are yourselves translators the way I was, or your children are themselves translators. In other words, they're involved in trying to make connections, trying to create shared understandings across difference. So the reason I mention that up front, beyond saying something about myself, is that in unexpected ways, I think many people, in many ways, especially in the world of the TDSB, are probably practicing civil discourse on a regular basis. We just don't call it civil discourse. We call it life in Canada in a diverse population. But just reflect a little bit on that sense of negotiating dialogue across difference when you are dealing with the great diversity of people in a TDSB classroom in a Toronto neighborhood. Now, that having been said, in terms of my own trajectory into this current job, after growing up in Oshawa, I came to the University of Toronto very happily for my undergraduate degree in English. I went to Boston University for a PhD in English, and eventually I made it back to Toronto, taking up my first job at then Ryerson University, now Toronto Metropolitan University. And then from there, I came to the U of T. And along the way, I got married. My wife and I have 4 beautiful daughters. We live in the east end of the city. And I have taken on a lot of different leadership roles at the University of Toronto. I was the principal of St. Michael's College, one of the colleges at the St. George campus. I'm now the Vice Dean undergraduate for Arts and Science at U of T, and I am the university's advisor on civil discourse. Why did I get this job? No one at U of T would have known that in 1982 Oshawa, I was busy dealing with telemarketers on behalf of my Sri Lankan parents. That's not what it was. Instead, it was 2 things. The first, I was serving as the University of Toronto's Vice Provost for Faculty in 2023, which means I was in that job, which was all about professors and how to support professors, how to respond to complaints about professors. I was in that job after the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's subsequent and ongoing military campaign that then transpired in Gaza and elsewhere. Now, as I am sure many of you know, I suspect all of you know, this led to divisive protests and complaints at the University of Toronto and elsewhere, in university campuses and elsewhere all over North America and indeed around the world. And so I worked with colleagues here at U of T to figure out how to respond when students, fellow faculty, sometimes staff, sometimes alumni and members of the community were upset by statements that professors were making, often via social media, while at the same time trying to figure out how best to defend and affirm the freedoms of those professors to speak as they wanted to about difficult things. So I was doing that job in 2023. At the same time, I'm a novelist and I'm an English professor. And one of the things that really interests me is what I call the public life of books. The public life of books. When I when I was working on my research in this area, I became especially interested in the writer Salman Rushdie, an Indian-born British writer now living in the United States, who is best known for his 1988 novel, The Satanic Verses. Again, as many of you may know, this novel, The Satanic Verses, was the source of major controversy when it was published because of its representations of Islam and the Prophet, which led the Ayatollah Khomeini, then the leader of Iran, to issue a fatwa on Rushdie. My interest is this: how can we have a novel that for some people is the source of entertainment and education, and for others is so offensive that it can lead to violence and become a political controversy? How can we live in a shared society when this one thing, a novel, can be these two things at once? That's what I call the public life of books. So I mention that to say that I am interested as a writer and as a scholar in this subject of how, again, to sustain a difficult conversation across really serious differences, while at the same time, I am a university administrator who's had a lot of experience dealing with these difficulties. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that those difficulties, which became immediately evident after October 7th and since then in a lot of ways, weren't created by that. Instead, the protests that we saw in fall 2023 were much more the effect of challenges that we have had in thinking out loud together for a long time. So let me explain what I mean by that. My definition of civil discourse is a commitment to thinking out loud together, to recognizing difference and disagreement, and understanding these as good things if they can lead to an increase in a shared understanding of an idea or an issue that matters. And even if you can't get to a shared understanding, at least you better understand someone else's perspective through that conversation. Civil discourse, understood in these ways, aids in the pursuit of truth, it advances knowledge, and it serves the common good. And if we can't do that at universities, if we can't think out loud at universities, where else could we do it? Now, having said that, once I started my job, a friend of mine called me, a guy I grew up with in Oshawa, and he said, "You got this new job as a civil discourse advisor at U of T. Is this a promotion or are they getting ready to fire you?" And his saying that kind of gives you a sense of the high stakes involved, maybe, with having a difficult conversation across differences. But what I have been struck by in this work so far is that the challenges of civil discourse, while very obvious on university campuses, aren't limited to university campuses. I hear from people from all walks of life across this country that they struggle with the practice of civil discourse, with thinking out loud with others in their personal lives, with family members, with neighbors, in their workplaces, and in thinking about our shared lives as citizens of this country. The challenges of civil discourse are everywhere. And why? So let me say a little bit now about some of the sources of the challenge to civil discourse. I'll begin with trust. I'd like to suggest to you that we are facing a profound crisis of trust. People don't trust each other the way they used to. In my experience, students don't trust professors that if they raise their hand and say something that the professor disagrees with politically, the professor won't penalize them in terms of their grades. Professors don't trust students that if they, let's say, use the wrong terminology, they won't be captured on social media and then publicly shamed for it. Professors and students don't trust the university's administration, and the university's administration doesn't trust professors and students. There is this crisis of trust, but it's not just at universities, it's more generally. It's what social scientists call the phenomenon of a low trust environment. How can we think out loud with each other? How can we have a difficult conversation if we don't trust each other? That even if we disagree, even if I get this wrong while I'm speaking to you, you're not going to understand what I'm trying to do. You're not going to give me the benefit of the doubt. Related to trust is fear. Again, this is what I hear often in my work, especially in workplaces. Let's say it's a staff room in a TDSB school. People are fearful of their colleagues finding out what they really think about something, let's say vaccines. At the same time, they are really fearful of finding out what their colleague thinks about, let's say, vaccines. But the most interesting one is they're afraid of about what they might think themselves. In other words, I hope you all have this experience. When we're thinking about something out loud, we don't have a perfectly formed position on something. Instead, as you say things, you realize something, you want to express yourself, you want to understand yourself, and you might get it wrong. You might surprise yourself with what you end up saying compared to what you thought you were going to say. So what do? We don't say anything. We look at our screens, we look away, we make small talk, we move away from difficult conversations because it's just easier, isn't it? To look at your phone. It's just easier to stay away from the possibility that you might offend someone, you might be offended by someone, you might offend yourself with what you actually think. So, trust and fear have replaced what? Curiosity. Think about this, especially when it comes to our children. Curiosity has to be at the core of learning. Why are things the way they are? How can I learn more about this? How can I learn more about you and why you think that and where you're coming from? One very practical thing I would suggest to you is that to build trust, we need to be less fearful of each other and more curious about each other. And that will help when it comes to strengthening civil discourse. I'm going to pause there on trust and fear and invite any questions on that subject before I move on to my next one. Are there any questions about trust and fear in relation to the challenge of having a difficult conversation?
At this point, please feel free to raise your hand. We will acknowledge you and open your mic so you're able to respond.
I see a question from Kate Gatto. Thank you, Kate. I'm thinking about folks who feel victimized. Can you speak to this and fear? Yeah, it's an excellent question. In other words, I think what you're describing there, Kate, is the challenge that when we go into a conversation with others, we're not at perfect equal balance. In other words, we have individual life experiences, historical experiences that inform us and how we approach things. And if we can't at least acknowledge that, it becomes very difficult. So you're right, asking people who may feel victimized to take a greater risk than, let's say, someone who's a professor at the University of Toronto who has this job to talk about difficult things. It's a lot easier for me to do that than for others. And so the question becomes, how do we create the least bad conditions? I'm being realistic here. For someone to feel like they have enough trust in the room that they can speak even if they're feeling otherwise victimized. I think that's where trust comes in. And maybe that's where curiosity can replace fear in terms of trying to understand why they feel that way and what they might want to do or say or think about beyond that. Thank you for your question. A second question comes to us. I think the problem nowadays is the mob mentality and cancel culture. How do you deal with that? That's a question that I'm assuming from the term cancel culture has a lot to do with online culture and with technology. And I'll just say it is a big problem. I hear you. And actually, technology is going to be something that I discuss a little later in this talk. So I'm going to pause on that question. I think we'll deal with that one a little later. I'll take these final two questions and then we'll stop there. What happens when the curiosity is one-sided? How can you approach the conversation when the other side thinks they are in the right? That is an excellent question. And it's a really tough spot to be in. When you might be uncertain and that person is 100% certain. That seems to me like a real challenge. I can remember about a year ago being in a conversation with some public health experts, and it was about civil discourse and vaccines. And someone asked me the question, how do you deal with a patient who is completely wrong about vaccines? And my response to that was, well, you begin by not assuming they're completely wrong. Maybe they're mostly wrong. They're almost completely wrong. They're probably wrong. But if what you bring to a conversation is a sense that you're completely wrong about this, therefore I'm completely right, that's not a conversation. That's not thinking out loud together. That's not civil discourse. And so if the curiosity is one-sided, unfortunately, I don't see that as an occasion for thinking out loud with someone else. I don't see that as an opportunity to learn together. And I'll just be honest, there's only so much time in the day. I think you move on. Last question on this subject comes to us from Laura. How do we support civil discourse for each grade level, both at home and at school? A good, practical question. And thank you very much for that. I think the most important feature is modeling. In other words, I don't think there should be a manual for civil discourse. I don't think there should be a webinar for civil discourse. I think we learn with each other together in ways that make sense, that are age appropriate. And so at the primary level, it's maybe mostly, to my mind, learning how to listen well, learning to be patient, learning to let someone else go first, you know? And again, I defer to people who would know much more about this, but that seems to me age appropriate. And as students get a little older, and that works at home as much as in the classroom, when students get older, they move into intermediate or they go into high school, to my mind, as they're starting to think about the world around them, as they're starting to socialize in different ways, I think really the most important thing there is to try to make sure, and I say this with 4 teenage daughters, that their primary models for behavior aren't found online to the kind of influencers who use aggressive and extreme tactics to generate attention. I think we need to move away from that. That seems to me very, very important. And again, it comes down to modeling. And I'll just say one more thing on that front. And you all know this if you're parents or if you're in the classroom. We all complain about students and their phones. And we are all constantly on our phones ourselves. We are terrible role models. We're complaining about how the kids can't put these things down, and we can't put these down. And so, in very simple ways, making the small decisions to spend less time online yourself will, I hope, create more space for our students and our young people to spend less on time. I'm enjoying very much the positive emojis. Thank you. Let me move on. Thank you for those questions, which were all excellent. We've talked about trust in relation to curiosity and fear. But now, and this speaks also to that question about feeling victimized and still wanting to have a conversation. How do you do that? One of the great challenges we have these days is how people experience power. This sense that there are people with power in the world, and I'm not one of them. Power is elsewhere, in other words. And so this is what I hear a lot in my work, that people feel frustrated. They feel discouraged because they want to change something, but they feel like they don't have the power to do it. And power is somewhere else. Somebody else is making these decisions. Somebody else is telling us what to do. And I don't know how to navigate this system. I think this is probably especially the case for new Canadians or newly arrived immigrants trying to negotiate this world. But then, even beyond that, I would say many people, I think, feel like power exists in the world. It determines who gets to do what, it determines access. And I don't have it. Someone else has it. And so I think what we might want to reflect on a little bit is how power is a challenge when it comes to civil discourse. But maybe just as importantly, we can reflect on when we do have some power ourselves. Parents' voices, children's voices, teachers' voices. They're not all dominating. They won't win every time, and they probably shouldn't if you think about the fact that we live in this diverse world with different perspectives. But reflect on the power you do have, the ways in which you can make a change. You might not be able to change the entire system, but if you can have a better conversation with the other people on your street, with the other parents at drop off, that's a small and good win. And so reflect a little bit on power and the ways in which, yes, power always feels like it's somewhere else. But what kind of power might you have that where you could actually effect a change, however small it helps? Next, and this will be a big one, I imagine, technology. We've already spoken about it a little bit. During the pandemic, while working at the University of Toronto, I was the vice dean in charge of what's called academic continuity. What that means is during the pandemic, I was responsible for making sure that we could continue offering courses here in the Faculty of Arts and Science at U of T to undergraduate students, while at the same time respecting public health directives. And what this meant, often enough, certainly for certain periods of time, as you all know, would be online learning. In retrospect, and I say this about myself at least, the message that I think in retrospect I gave a lot of young people was that the best thing they could do to help with public health and the greater good was to spend all day long by themselves in front of a screen. Just think about that for a moment. At the time, it made sense in terms of what we were doing to try to keep people safe during the pandemic. But if you think about what it means for young people to have been formed, even for people just graduating and going into their first jobs, to have their kind of formation be so significantly online, then guess what? When they're now in person with others and someone says something they disagree with, and they're right beside them. They can't just turn off their camera. They can't leave the chat. They have to spend hours with this person for the rest of the year. That has been one of the unexpected consequences of all the many advantages that technology has created for us. The other, of course, would be that we are connected in ways that we have never been before, thanks to technology these days. But that means that things accelerate, things go quickly. It's the mob mentality that someone mentioned in an earlier question, and that idea of cancel culture. And so, why bother saying anything if I might be recorded, I might be captured, I might be misrepresented online, and then it's all over? So, why bother? Now, I am mindful that all of you, like me as a parent, are dealing with the challenges of technology generally in terms of how it relates to our young people and their social lives and their physical and mental health. But I'm curious now if there are any questions related to how technology hurts or helps when it comes to civil discourse. So while I'm waiting for anyone who wants to speak about the challenges of technology, I do see there's another question here. How do you work towards letting go of distrust when you have a genuine curiosity, a desire for positive change, and a goal of having a productive conversation? Very well said. When there is a high chance of being labeled as anti something. You're absolutely right. That is the challenge. That's where we go to trust. If you are in a conversation with someone and you can't trust that they won't immediately jump in that direction, then it's a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of courage to be willing. And, to my mind, and I'll say a little bit about this later on, maybe the way to avoid that is to get out in front of it. In other words, to say up front, you might think I am anti something with what I'm about to say, but that's one model. The other model is if you are in a conversation and you are, as you say, open in the ways that you're describing here, you could ask the question, why do you think I'm anti something? Why can't you kind of engage with what I'm actually saying here, as opposed to just immediately assuming this about who I am? That seems to me like maybe one approach. But I will confess right now, I am stunned. Nobody has any questions or comments about technology. Just like that. Here we go. One came in from Minusa. Thank you, Minusa. How do you manage individuals who seem to have one way of articulating themselves in person, but in an online platform, they have no filter and can easily offend others in a group setting? Excellent question, and one of our serious problems these days. Online culture, as I suspect you all know, because of how algorithms work, rewards the more extreme statements and the more outrageous behavior. There are lots of studies showing that the simpler, blunter, more aggressive statements tend to get more likes, tend to get more attention online. And keep in mind, this isn't attention from fellow human beings. This is attention that is filtered through a pathway created by algorithms. So at some level, we think we're all responding, and of course we are, but there's also some engineering going on here. And what that does is it has an effect on people, sometimes in person, or as you say, there can be these divides. Personally, I think the divide is painful. To be one kind of person when you're with others and one kind of person online. And I would just say, Mianusa, what you might consider doing is just asking someone who's doing that, why do you behave this way online? Why wouldn't you behave that way in person? Or if you behaved opposite in each situation, what would happen? And it might occasion some reflection, some self-insight about that distinction. Thank you for your question. Osmundo asks, When the other party turns to ad hominem, is it better to just leave the conversation? So Osmundo, is a very good question. When the other party starts insulting you and ignoring whatever you have to say, frankly, yes, I don't think that person has joined that conversation in good faith. They're not there to learn with you. They're not there to figure something out together. They're insulting you. And to my mind, if you don't affirm the dignity, the inherent dignity of the other person in a conversation, you're not practicing civil discourse, and maybe I don't want to speak to you. But if you do affirm the inherent dignity of that other person, have a difficult conversation. And you're right, Osmundo, that the big change is whether you are attacking the person's ideas or the person themselves. Thank you for your question. From Michelle. What I think about technology is good in one way, that our children can get their work done and help what they need. You're absolutely right. That is the great challenge. The very fact that we're able to do this evening is because of technology. So there are absolutely positives, and it would be, I think, irresponsible of me to say, "Oh, we should all just give up completely." The question is, how do we use technology well? To the next question about AI and ethics when it comes to responsibility in managing biases. My key point there would be literacy. We have to understand how these technology platforms, how these algorithms, how these large language models are operating so as to better understand how it's affecting our relationships to each other. So it seems to me the key point there is we need to understand better. So it's not just learning how to use AI, but I think it's upstream from that. What is AI? We all just say it these days, and we have some vague general sense of what it means. I keep saying algorithm. I probably, as an English professor, couldn't really explain to you what an algorithm is. It's a formula that determines things. That's about as much as I can tell you. So I think we need better literacy. Okay, I'll take these last couple of questions. There's 4 left here, and then I think we're gonna have to move on. Uh, Huda says technology definitely expands the possibility of civil discourse, but at the same time, it can be degrading of shared facts. More people join the conversation, but then the conversation goes left. So this can absolutely happen where people join, and at scale, it's very hard to sustain. You know, I mean, we would be having a very different conversation if it was 6 of us in a room together, as opposed to 150, 200 people online. Kerry Watts observed that it's easier for me to articulate myself through text than verbally. How do I ask for accommodation when it is more typically accepted to have difficult conversation in person? That's a tough question. I think maybe just being okay with the fact that um, you're going to be more imprecise, maybe not as comfortable in person, maybe trying it out with one other person through speech might be a help. It can be very difficult. I suspect many of you at some point have been involved in long text arguments, WhatsApp arguments, Facebook comment fights, where it can be very draining. And so the question, I think, Carrie, is can you find someone you trust completely who's patient in terms of just dealing with the different time scale of something like that? That seems to me important, but that can be a difficulty that you'd have to figure out. Lamia asks, how to make students to love reading in this challenging time of technology innovation. Amen, says this English professor and novelist. I often have said in these talks, the best way that we can support civil discourse is to put down our phones and pick up books. Reading slows us down. Reading opens up our imaginations. Reading novels, for example, lets us see other lives and understand the world from different perspectives. But maybe more importantly, it slows us down. There's nothing, to my mind, more wonderful than watching, now it's just my youngest daughter, frankly, more than anyone else, lost in a book. I hope many of you at some point have had that experience, or you've seen it in your children. They kind of look up and they're confused because they've been so fully immersed in another world because of how their imaginations are working, as opposed to the glazed look from just tap, tap, tap. Go to the Toronto Public Library, read books with your children, show them that you yourself love reading. And again, it slows you down. You know, I'll even go a step further. This is very practical. In my own household this past summer, and my wife has a PhD in English, I have a PhD in English, we're a very book-friendly family, but we realized that our daughters couldn't watch a movie without having their phones with them to kind of tap, tap, tap while they're watching a movie. And so we started proposing no phones and we'll watch a movie together as a family, not even reading. And that was challenging, including for me and my wife. And so what I would suggest to you is start to build in time where for 30 minutes or an hour, you're doing one thing together. Ideally, you're reading together. And if it's not going to be reading, at the very least, let it be watching a movie or a TV show together, device free, hands free, just watching together. And then, this is the most important thing, talking about it afterwards. Not everybody runs to grab their devices, but what did you think about that? What did you like about that? What did you disagree about that? Having a conversation that way. And then what you're doing is you are strengthening those connections with your kids. And then hopefully they become a little more curious. In other words, if you show that you're curious about what they think about something, maybe they can do that themselves when they go off to school the next day. They can model, if we model it with them. So reading, very important. Even watching a movie at this stage is very important. If we can just slow people down and strengthen those muscles, the muscles involved with reading, with imagination, with understanding in a slow way, that to my mind is perhaps more important than anything else when it comes to strengthening our ability to think out loud together. And eventually, ideally, what this would mean is that we would all have a more moderate relationship to technology itself. Okay, I've seen a few other very good insights in the chat from Barbara. I see a question there about technology from Michelle and from Madja. I think, just very quickly, because I want to respect these questions and then we're going to move on, helping our kids understand how to discern content when they come across online. I hear you about that one. That comes back to, I think, literacy, to have them maybe be a little more skeptical about what they hear there, to be a bit more willing to listen to their parents. I hear you again. You know, the worst thing sometimes is, or the best way that a kid knows not to believe something is that their parents say that's what it is. You know, they're incredibly suspicious that way sometimes. So greater literacy there, and then building trust somewhere else, again, through reading or something along those lines. Madja wonders about some of the challenges of technology. I very much agree with what you've cited there in terms of cybersecurity, data privacy, and ethical dilemmas. Georgina, excellent point. Board games, another great way to spend good time together. To, again, slow down and not spend so much time online, as Michelle notes. And finally, Maria points out technologies like protein, essential in the right amount, but harmful when consumed in excess. Yeah, that's very well said. It can build some muscles, but you don't want to look like this at the end if all you're doing is spending all that time on protein. Well said. Okay, it's 7:25 in the evening in this live session. And so what I want to do is maybe just make a couple more suggestions for some of the challenges, and then I want to turn to some possible solutions. The one challenge I think we have is finding local solutions to what feel like very big problems. In other words, I hope my conversation with you today, based on my work as the University of Toronto's advisor on civil discourse, has given you some suggestions for how to strengthen dialogue across difference and difficult conversations in your own personal and professional worlds and in our school settings. But what works at U of T doesn't necessarily work at Danforth Gardens. What works at Adam Beck doesn't necessarily work at a school in the West End, at the Etobicoke School for the Arts, let's say. Do you see what I mean? We need to find solutions that make sense in and with our local communities. And so, one thing you could do, for instance, is see an approach to dialogue across difference somewhere and share it with your local community. Not to say, here's what we're going to do here, but instead, what could we learn from this model? What makes sense for us? And then why is this definitely not us? But I think having a conversation that way will ensure that local solutions make sense for the local community. Okay, that seems to me very, very important. And we should always propose ideas, not impose ideas. Propose, don't impose. That seems to me another important distinction to make. Finally, in terms of the concept that we need, what we need to bring to our conversations, and this is in many ways very difficult. It's the concept, and here, folks, I'm going to go full professor on you for a moment. It's the concept of epistemic humility. Epistemic humility. This is a term developed by a man named Michael Spence. He is a legal scholar, and he is the president of University College London. The term epistemic humility refers to the idea that no one can know everything. And Michael Spence proposes that we cannot practice civil discourse if we're not willing to admit we don't know everything about this subject. And he goes even further in his suggestions. He proposes, I don't know everything about this subject, even if this subject is based on my lived experience. I still might be wrong about part of this. So think about how hard that is for people. And I don't mean about a difficult topic, but about any topic, frankly, especially one where you feel like your own lived experience gives you insights and authority that no one else has. You still might be wrong. He argues, and I agree with him, that if we don't practice humility, if we only practice pride, we'll never learn anything from each other. We need humility to promote understanding and trust. But it can be very hard to practice humility when you're dealing with someone who absolutely rejects the concept, who thinks they know everything about this subject. Topic closed, this is over. Again, in a situation like that, you can only go so far, and then I think you need to move on. But just think for a moment about the importance of epistemic humility, of admitting you might be wrong. And again, practically, let's say you are in a difficult conversation with someone. Hopefully, they will respond well if you begin this way. You know, I'm not sure about this, but this is what I think. You know, I might be wrong about this, but this is what I think. That is being vulnerable. That is being humble. That is inviting someone into a conversation where together you're going to figure something out. Now, if that person responds by attacking you, by insulting you, don't waste your time. But the hope is that that kind of openness that you're modeling, that you're taking the courage to model, is something that they will themselves be willing to try. Some of you have probably heard of the concept of a brave conversation. It's a term that's often used when it comes to civil discourse. But as far as I'm concerned, the bravest thing is admitting you might be wrong about something. That is harder than listening to someone you disagree with. That is harder than engaging in a divisive subject. If you are willing to say up front, I'm wrong, that takes real courage. Okay. Next, I want to say a little bit about, no, actually, I was going to talk about leadership and professional life, but I see these two questions are actually on that very subject. So I'm going to just go right to these questions, and then I'll turn to the next part of my talk. Lamia says, sometimes you and others with you at work know that what you said is true, but no one supports you because you are in a high post at work. So that has to do with professional stakes. And I'm a professor. I have academic freedom in a lot of ways that protects me in terms of saying things, teaching things, writing things that others may disagree with. I can't speak to people in other professions where they are exposed in a very different way, where there's very different pressures. Anna says, what do you do in a position of leadership when you are repeatedly modeling accountability and openness to growth and improvement, but many of the individuals you are leading do not take any accountability? I hear that. No, I'm just kidding. I love the University of Toronto. But that can be a very lonely place to be, I would say, Anna. And I would argue that in situations like that, start smaller, or maybe say as much. Be vulnerable that way. Say, this is what you're trying to do, and this is the challenge that you have. And then you ask people, how can we make this better together? How can we strengthen this? I'm willing to be accountable when it comes to this and this and this. I invite you to do the same. But if you keep on trying and you're still getting nowhere with that, then it can be a very difficult and, again, lonely place to be. From an anonymous member, what if the pride a person has is based on their values? How would you ask or model humility in that case? Excellent point. I would encourage you to Google Michael Spence and the term epistemic humility. I could try right now, but in the interest of time, he has an essay that's easily found online that speaks exactly to that very direct challenge, where it's a very personal, values-based position, and you're still considering that you might be wrong about it. So thank you for that. Thank you, Jonathan, for that very thoughtful note there about epistemic humility. From another anonymous attendee, what you're suggesting about epistemic humility is most understandable on an interpersonal level, but when the know-it-all party is an institution, that humility is too threatening and nearly non-existent. As parents, how do we effectively tell institutions that they are wrong or missing the full perspective on particular issues? This goes back to my earlier observation that power feels elsewhere. Institutions are places that are subject to a lot of criticism and frustration because they do feel remote, they feel all powerful, and people can't understand where and how decisions are made. It's an excellent point. It's something that's probably true in schools, school board level, it's certainly true at the university. And it seems to me that there are a couple of models here. The one model would be to try to become more involved formally. In other words, to be what I would call an institutional actor, to try to take more, be more present and have maybe a voting role in some institutional body like a school board or a parent-teacher association. The other, I think, is to be perhaps more literate about how decisions are made, where you can intervene and feel like you've had a positive effect. But I know, especially at the scale we deal with in our schools and in our city, it can be a very difficult situation to be in. But remember, institutions aren't themselves actors. They're made up of fellow human beings. And so then the question becomes, can you have a conversation with anyone in an institution where they're willing to acknowledge, as an institution, we're doing this, but I hear you as a person, and there might be a little bit of understanding there, or at least that would be the hope. I hear you about the challenges of leading council as a chair. I've had experiences like this myself in other contexts. And I understand, again, from an anonymous attendee, the great challenge of WhatsApp culture, of the ways in which these large groups can become sources of great division. You know, I can think of multiple occasions where people have said to me, especially about the Israel-Palestine question, online chats have broken friendships, that people just no longer interact with each other. I hear this about families, that extended families will have a WhatsApp chat and something will come into it that is divisive. Again, maybe about vaccines, maybe about the situation in the US, I don't know, but people will immediately kind of divide over it. And it just doesn't happen online. It happens in your kind of full life because of the continuum between our online communications and our in-person experiences. Okay, I'm going to take one more question here, and then we're getting closer now to the end of our time together. How can one explain the difference between discomfort and being unsafe during a difficult conversation? If this cannot be agreed on, can a good faith conversation even exist? Great question. One of the very important facts, I think, of a conversation is trying to ensure that you share an understanding about what you're actually talking about and why. Why are we speaking with each other? What is, to put it in simple terms, the goal of our doing so? It's at least to understand each other's perspectives. How are we going to get there? And if we're going to get there, it might involve some disagreement. It might involve some statements, some terminology that makes you uncomfortable. If you claim it makes you unsafe, do you mean that you feel as if there is a threat of physical violence? Is that what you mean by being unsafe? Now, in most cases, that's not the case. It's more of a psychological safety or or a kind of a holistic worry about being challenged. And that can be a very difficult thing. In my mind, you don't go directly to that point, but instead, you try to take a step back and try to understand why that person feels that way. And then you try to build together a little bit of trust. So, again, what are we doing? To kind of go back to earlier points in this talk, you practice curiosity in that case. Why would you feel unsafe in talking about this? Let me understand. I don't care what the subject is. I want to understand a little bit more about you. And hopefully, doing that demonstrates that you are in good faith. Doing that means that they might be a little more willing to have a conversation where they may be challenged, they may be proven wrong about something that matters to them intellectually, that matters to them personally, politically. That seems to me the way to go. Okay. I want to end with perhaps a story that may give you some insight into some of the challenges that we have with civil discourse. Last year, the University of Toronto invited Justice Marion Buller to campus. Some of you may know Justice Buller was the first Indigenous woman named to the federal bench, and she led the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls from 2016 to 2019. The reason we invited her to campus, to the University of Toronto, Mississauga specifically, is when you think about someone who's had difficult conversations, I can't think of anyone in this country who's probably had more difficult conversations than Justice Buller. She gave a wonderful talk about listening, about dialogue. And then in the Q&A afterwards, a student asked her, how do you deal with someone who, I'll use the example that was used then, rejects the possibility that there may be human remains at a residential school in Canada, let's say in Kamloops, says, no, there's no remains there. I have research that says no. This is what the news reports say. No. Justice Buller gave the following advice, which I found myself, I learned from a great deal. She said, what you should not say in response is, why do you think that? Because that immediately leads to an argument. It can go into ad hominem or kind of personal insult world as a result. She said, what you should ask is, why do you want to think that? Think about that distinction. Not why do you think that? Why do you want to think that? In posing a question that way, two things happen. First, the person demonstrates curiosity instead of immediately taking offense or being fearful. Second, you are creating space for someone else to tell you about where they're coming from. You're not having a political conversation or a debate about about Indigenous experience in the residential school system in Canada. You're not doing that. You're trying to understand where someone else is coming from. And in doing that, you might be able to build more of a shared understanding of why this question matters. You may still disagree. You may still have completely different views on it, but at least you can better understand the other person by asking the right kind of question and listening for the best form of their answer, the thing you can really kind of respond to in a positive way. This is difficult. This is not easy. This takes patience. This takes courage to make the small decision in dealing with someone you disagree with to search for the one thing in there that you can agree with, and then to say that part back to them, to say, I'm with you on this. And what do you hope? You hope they respond the same way. You hope they then see that as an opportunity to learn more. But now, importantly, Justice Buller said, if you try this and the person just comes right back at you in a kind of angry way, she said, don't bother. You've got to move on. They're not there, in other words. Their intention isn't to think out loud with you. Their intention isn't to have a difficult conversation, to dialogue across difference itself. No, they're there to make a point, and you are a convenient way for them to do so. If that's the case, walk on. If, however, there is an openness to dialogue, then you should, if you can, make a good effort to join that, to do that difficult work. And more importantly, I think, to do that with and for our children, to do it in our classrooms, to do it in the playground, to do it at drop off and pick up, school excursions, parent teacher interview night, PTA meetings, and then, of course, to do it in our homes. Remember how I began this by observing that I'm the University of Toronto's advisor on civil discourse. But if young people start learning civil discourse when they show up at a place like U of T and they're 18, at some level, we've already lost. We need to start earlier in encouraging students towards curiosity, towards a more thoughtful approach to technology, a more trusting approach to each other and to their parents, to their teachers, and vice versa, a better understanding of power, a better understanding ultimately that what's going to work has to make sense for our local community together. That is how we think out loud together. That is civil discourse in action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Randy, for that. You're seeing a number of applause and acknowledgement for what you have shared with us this evening. Definitely a lot to think about. I certainly hope that you've left bits with all of our attendees this evening. I appreciate you defining civil discourse for us. Because I know that language may be new to some of our attendees. So thank you for doing that, but also for providing us with the key, I'm going to say the key principles around civil discourse, if I may use that language. And one that really resonates with me, and I had done this when I'd read your information before, is the idea of epistemic humility. And I'm going to take some liberties and ask a question because within our board, we have what we call school councils, Randy. And you're probably familiar, you use the language PTAs, that's similarly what that is. How in our environments where it gets really hot, where someone's lived experience and identities constantly feel it's being challenged in that place, in the spaces of the, I call it the smaller families that they're in all our schools. How do you practice this when you feel that it's your identity, it's your
Yeah.
lived reality? How do you do this, particularly in heated moments?
So I think it's even higher stakes than that, Michelle. Thank you for that excellent and very thoughtful question. What happens when it's about your kids? Like it's one thing if it's about you,
Right.
but if it's your children who you feel are being pressured or even threatened in terms of how something is being taught or represented or responded to, I can't think of a higher stakes moment. And I would suggest to you that in situations like that, we can't start practicing civil discourse. That's like trying to go from 0 to 60 in rush hour traffic. It's not going to work. So it seems to me like if we can replenish a fuller sense of trust and a fuller sense of humility, then we can bring that to these moments. In other words, maybe they don't then get that heated. I acknowledge they do. They probably do in ways that make news even. But if there are ways to layer in other trust building opportunities so that, you know what, Michelle, you and I probably do disagree about this, but I know you take me seriously. So I think that's where I would go with this. And I say that as someone who spent a lot of time dealing with people very upset about things that have happened at the university. They don't necessarily agree, but they want to be heard. And it seems to me that is really important. So it's I think it's people in positions of leadership, frankly, who could do a better job of making sure that people feel heard. And I'll go a step further. Um, there's this term. It's called the scandal of particularity. We might. It's a religious term. We all agree there's a divine being. Sure, there's some divine presence, but really, it's a little baby born in Bethlehem who then grew up and became the savior of the world. Like the scandal of particularity, right? So, when you're having a heated conversation, to my mind, people feel more heard when you actually speak to what they've said rather than thank you for your submission. That's an important perspective. To my mind, that doesn't take people seriously, and they probably feel insulted and frustrated. But if you're willing to say, I know you're this upset because it's not just about you, it's about your children, and there's nothing more important than your children to you. How can we, and then you kind of try to build from there. But I think people need to feel heard. And if they don't feel heard, I think they become so much more frustrated. And I'll go maybe just a little further and suggest that once they feel heard, I think you should still be a realist about it. This is how much we can do. This is our turning radius. These are our resources. And I agree with you that this is frustrating. And I'm grateful that you took the time to tell me. And I hear you. If people feel heard, even if they don't get what they were hoping for, I think I think the temperature comes down, to use your term. Thank you for that excellent question.
And thank you for that response. I'm watching the time. I'm going to honor Beverly's hand has been raised for a minute.
Sure.
Can someone just open the mic for Beverly so her question can be posed?
Yeah, her mic has been turned on.
Thank you.
Hi,
Go ahead,
Beverly.
Beverly.
Oh, no, sorry. I was trying to click on the reaction and it clicked on that one. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. That's great. So on that note, I want to thank you, Randy, for joining us and providing such great insights and tidbits. There are a few things I know I'm walking away with that I have written down for myself to practice.
Great.
Because I fully agree with you when you say the only way we're going to get good at it is if in our everyday lives, we
Yes.
practice it. We practice listening. We practice trust. We practice curiosity. If we
Yes.
remember that what is and go back to the days of children when we used to value curiosity, right? And so, and this piece that you talked about in terms of truth and knowledge, those tidbits I'm going to take with me as well. And this idea about power and powerless and how one approaches that. So thank you for those tidbits. There are a number of questions about whether this will be recorded. It is recorded and it will be live, folks, on the TDSB PCCEO's YouTube page. Please just give us some time to clean this up so we can get it posted for you and that you'll be able to review and watch. We're also going to put in the chat a curated list of resources because with the conversation series, we know we never have enough time to go deep. So we have just tried to put together resources of some
Great
videos,
idea.
podcasts, articles that you'll be able to sort of go deeper and learn more. My school council leaders on the line, I encourage you that once we post this video, it may be something you want to bring into your school council meeting. It may be a conversation you want to have around this, or you want to circulate the resource list. Please don't call me and say, Michelle Monroe, you have American content. I do have some American resources on that list. I do, because it came up and I reviewed and it seemed okay. So on that note, what we want to do now, we're going to put a questionnaire out and we really want your feedback. We want to hear from you if this was value added, if you've learned a few things, and we've turned it into a poll because we've gotten feedback that it's just easier way to do. So the poll is up right now. I'm just asking if you'll just take just a couple minutes to just complete the poll before you leave us, and that we're able to get a sense of this was value added. And so we can continue to think about the next conversation that we will host for you. So thank you. I'm actually seeing that individuals are completing that poll. Thank you so much. And that is all we have for you this evening. We appreciate you taking the time and the evening from your family being here with us. We thank you for doing that because we know there are multiple things you could be doing this evening as parents and caregivers. So please look out for our conversation series. We have 2 more that is upcoming. We will communicate it broadly with the hope that you'll be able to join us. And we're almost close to the completion of the poll. Oh, the numbers are rising, so we're really hoping. If you've not yet completed, please continue to do so. And on that note, we wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you again, everyone.
Bye,
And thank
everybody.
you again, Randy.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. Go read a good book.
If you're with us before